Laura Fair was 33 years old. She lived in San Francisco with her mother and her young daughter, and in the autumn of 1870, she believed she was finally about to be married. The man she expected to marry was a lawyer named Alexander Crittenden. They had known each other for 7 years. She had come to him by a long road, through several states, several names, and more loss than most women her age had seen. By 1870, she had settled in the city with her mother, and she had let herself believe the waiting was nearly over. She had reason to believe it. She had his letters, years of them in his own careful hand, tied together and kept close. In them, Crittenden called her everything to him. He wrote of his wretchedness without her, of the future they would share once he was free, of a devotion that he renewed each time it was tested. Within a year, those same letters would be read aloud in a courtroom by the men trying to send her to the gallows for his murder. She did not know that yet. Outside her windows, the city was fog and gaslight and new money, the harbor lit by the lamps of the ferries that crossed the bay each evening to Oakland. Inside, Laura held a stack of paper that promised her a future, and she believed the promise was about to be kept. Stories like his tend to vanish from memory. If this one is new to you, liking the video and subscribing helps bring more of them back. Laura had already lived several lives by the time she reached San Francisco. She was born Laura Ann Hunt in Holly Springs, Mississippi, in 1837. Her family was small and moved often through the southern states, settling eventually in New Orleans. At 16, she married her first husband, William H. Stone, a liquor dealer 20 years her senior. He died within a year, leaving her, in her own words, without a farthing. She entered a convent school, the Convent of Visitation, to train as a teacher and to support herself. She did not stay long. She left school to marry Thomas Grayson, a man later described, in Laura's testimony, as a terrible drunkard and a violent one. The marriage collapsed after roughly 6 months, and Laura fled to San Francisco with her mother and her brother. In California, she met William D. Fair, an attorney in Shasta County. They married in 1859 and had a daughter, Lily. The family moved to San Francisco, but William could not establish himself there. In December 1861, he died of a gunshot wound to the head in a friend's office. The accounts of his death diverge and were never reconciled. One says he killed himself over money, another that he was driven to it by jealousy over Laura's relationship with an unknown man, and a third, Laura's own, implied he had been killed in a dispute over land. After William's death, Laura spent a brief season on the stage. She played Lady Teazle in the School for Scandal at the Metropolitan Theater in Sacramento, and her notices were good. She did not pursue acting. She took her pay and moved again, this time with her mother and Lily, across the mountains to Nevada, where silver had been discovered and everyone was getting rich. She bought a hotel called the Tahoe House, and this time the investment paid off. She was 26, a widow for the third time, and she was about to meet the man who would write her all those letters. Alexander Parker Crittenden was not the kind of man who passed through a room unnoticed. He was born in 1816 in Lexington, Kentucky, into a family whose name carried weight across the country. His uncle, John Jordan Crittenden, had served in the United States Senate. Alexander himself had entered West Point, where he had once been expelled for a prank and reinstated after appealing personally to President Andrew Jackson. He graduated in 1836, served briefly as a lieutenant of artillery, and left the Army. He read law, was admitted to the bar in Texas, and in 1849 he crossed through Mexico and Arizona on horseback to reach California nearly penniless by the time he arrived in Los Angeles. His career recovered quickly. He was elected to the first California legislature, chaired its Judiciary Committee, and authored the law that incorporated the city of Los Angeles. By the 1850s, he had a successful practice in San Francisco and had argued 26 cases before the state Supreme Court. He married Clara Churchill Jones in 1838, the year Laura Hunt was born in Mississippi. Together they had 14 children, of whom 8 survived infancy. Clara had joined him in California in 1852, crossing the Isthmus of Panama with 6 children and 2 servants. By 1861, Crittenden had become the chairman of the state's Southern Democratic Central Committee, a faction of Confederate sympathies. When the war required a loyalty oath he would not swear, he left San Francisco and relocated to Virginia City, Nevada Territory, to practice mining law. His family personified Lincoln's house divided. 2 of his sons ran off to join the Confederate Army without permission, and one of them, Churchill, was captured behind Union lines and executed as a spy in 1864. He had been 24 years old. In 1863, Crittenden took a room at a lodging house on South C Street. It was called the Tahoe House, and the woman who ran it was young, fair-haired, and recently widowed. He told her he was a single man. By some accounts, he told her he was a widower. For a time, what Laura had was a courtship carried on in the gaps of a busy man's life. Crittenden came and went. He traveled often to San Francisco, always on business, and he was never quite clear about the shape of his life there. There were absences he did not explain, and arrangements he did not describe, and he kept rooms and obligations that he mentioned only in passing. A separate house, somewhere down in the city. A trip he could not put off. A letter sent ahead, the reasons private. At the time, none of it seemed to mean very much. A lawyer with a practice in San Francisco would naturally have business in San Francisco, and a man crossing the long stage road over the mountains would naturally be gone for stretches at a time. Only in hindsight would the pattern take on another shape, the silences and the vagueness revealed as cover for what he had not said. The understanding came when a woman and a number of children arrived from the city, and Laura learned that the man who had courted her as a single man belonged to someone else. Crittenden did not deny it. He told Laura he would divorce Clara and marry her at the first opportunity. He rented a house for his wife and children, its rooms furnished and lamplit, and he kept a room of his own for business. And he began to move between the 2 households, as though both could be held at once. Laura, who had already given up a great deal to believe in him, chose to believe this too. She agreed to wait. That was the first of the promises. There would be many. Clara, for her part, knew that Laura existed. For a while she seemed to accept her husband's account that the 2 were only friends. At one point, she even agreed to let Laura take a room inside the family's own house, an arrangement so strange that the neighbors of both households must have remarked on it. It could not hold, and it did not. Yet for years in Virginia City and then in San Francisco, the same triangle went on, with Crittenden assuring each woman of what she needed to hear and keeping each of them waiting for something he was not willing to give. What followed was not a brief affair but a long one. 7 years of it, and its rhythm did not change. Crittenden would tell Laura the divorce was nearly done. He would send her east to Indiana, where the law was easier, and promise to follow and marry her there. The journey from California to Indiana in those years took weeks, the better part of a month by rail and stage, and Laura made it more than once. He did not follow. On one occasion, with the arrangements all but finished, he canceled, saying he could not afford the cost. Laura returned west, alone, each time to the same promise renewed. The strain of it showed in both of them, and in the rooms they moved through. When Laura once considered telling Clara the truth, Crittenden, by Laura's testimony, threatened to kill her and himself. He pointed a small pistol at his own head as he left the 2 women alone together. Laura said nothing to Clara and blamed her distress on a broken engagement with another man. Tempers rose and fell. Laura followed Crittenden home after one argument, and his son Howard met her at the front door and would not let her pass. According to the testimony of Clara and a daughter, Laura spoke of bloodshed as she left. A few days later, Crittenden went to Laura's house, and while he stood in the hallway, she fired a gun at him from the staircase. She said later that these were warning shots. No one was struck. No charges were filed. His letters carried the same devotion through all of it. The ink unhurried, the promises exact. No matter what happened in the rooms, on paper the tenderness held. The letters piled up. Laura kept them. In 1870, Laura tried to break the pattern. Her mother had been pressing her for years. A woman who had given herself to a married man was a ruined woman, and Laura's mother said so constantly. In August of that year, Laura married a young man named Jesse Snyder. By her own testimony, she did it partly to end the nagging, partly to force herself free. It did not work. When Crittenden learned of the marriage, his jealousy was immediate and consuming. He wrote to Laura that the thought of her with another man was destroying him. "I am wretched, insufferably, infinitely wretched," he told her. "Day and night I wander about like a ghost." He demanded that she stay away from her new husband. He arranged an elaborate scheme involving another woman and a pair of police detectives to manufacture grounds for adultery so that Laura could divorce Snyder. By September or October, Laura and Snyder had signed a mutual separation agreement. The marriage had lasted a matter of weeks. Laura and Crittenden reconciled. Each vowed to begin divorce proceedings. Laura had already made good on her promise. Crittenden had not. His last letter was tender, and it carried the same promise he had been writing for 7 years. Then Laura heard the news. Clara and the younger children were returning to San Francisco. Crittenden had purchased new furniture for the family home in anticipation. He was not leaving his wife. He had never intended to. While Laura waited in one house, another woman had been waiting in another. Clara Crittenden had married Alexander in 1838, the year that Laura Hunt was born in Mississippi. She had crossed to California by way of Panama to join him, bringing the younger children and 2 servants, and she had kept his household through his years in the legislature, his law practice, his travels, and his long absences across the mountains to Nevada. She had managed the home during the war years, while her husband refused the loyalty oath and their sons slipped away to fight for the Confederacy. She had looked after the family of a general's wife whose husband had gone east and fallen at Shiloh in 1862. She had also buried a son. Churchill, the boy who had joined the Confederate cavalry without his father's permission, was captured behind Union lines and executed as a spy in 1864. He was 24. Clara had lost a child to the war 6 years before she would lose her husband on the bay. She knew about Laura. She had known for years, and for years she had taken her husband at his word that it was nothing more than a friendship. When she went east with the younger children in the autumn of 1870, she left believing she would return to the same household she had always kept. The 2 women were, in the eyes of the time, opposites. One was the wife, respectable, wronged, and mourning. The other was the mistress, and the word carried its own verdict. Yet the same man had deceived them both. He had lied to Laura about being free, and he had lied to Clara about Laura, and each of them had built a life around promises he did not keep. They had even sat across from each other in the same rooms, while the lie he was telling moved between them. When the end came, it came in front of Clara. On the ferry, as the family sat together, the shot that killed Alexander Crittenden sent him slumping into his wife's lap. She would carry that. Then she would carry more. At the trial of the other woman, Clara took the witness stand in her mourning black, and her account left no room for sympathy toward Laura. She said she would never have agreed to a divorce. She had never been asked. The city would weep for one of these women and call for the rope for the other. Both had been deceived by the same man, and only one of them had fired a shot. Laura went to a gunsmith and traded the revolver she owned for a small 4-barreled pistol, a Sharps Derringer, the kind of thing a person could carry unseen in a fold of cloth. On the afternoon of November 3, 1870, she met Crittenden in the city. According to her later testimony, They spoke around 4:30, and he told her he was going to Oakland to meet his wife and children, who were arriving by train. She said he promised her one thing: he would not kiss Clara at the reunion. He would kiss no woman but Laura. She followed him. At the Oakland pier, dressed entirely in black and veiled, she watched through the cloth as the family came off the train and into Crittenden's arms. She saw the greeting she had been promised would not happen. She followed them onto the ferry, the El Capitan, as it pulled out across the bay in the failing light, the gas lamps already lit along the Oakland shore. She took a seat near them. For a time, she did nothing at all. She sat behind her black veil and watched the reunion, the husband and the wife, and the children settling in for the short crossing, while the engines worked and the water passed beneath the deck. Then, as the boat left the harbor, she rose. She crossed the deck. As Clara took her husband's arm, Laura drew the derringer from the folds of her dress and fired once into his chest. The man did not die at once. Crittenden's son Parker had been watching the veiled woman since the pier, uneasy at the way she studied his family. When his father was shot, Parker went after her. He found her on the boat, and when he named her as the one who had fired, she did not deny it. She said she had done it and had meant to. "He ruined both myself and my child," she said. A harbor policeman, Captain Kensel, took the pistol from her hand and placed her under arrest. What the witnesses described next was strange. She fell senseless and then woke into a kind of hysteria, and when someone handed her water in a glass, she bit a piece from the rim. Alexander Crittenden was carried home to San Francisco. He lived there, in a gaslit room with the bullet still in him, for the better part of 2 days. He died on November 5th. On the day of his funeral, the federal, state, and city courts all closed, and one of the largest crowds the city had yet seen came to bury him. The scope of the mourning said something about what the city believed it was losing. The man had helped write its laws. There was, briefly, a question of where the crime had even happened. The ferry had been crossing between 2 counties, and it was not at once clear in which of them Crittenden had been shot. It took an official survey of the harbor to determine that the shot had been fired in the waters of San Francisco. Twice now, Laura had spoken of her child. The daughter she meant was Lily, the girl she had raised through all the years of waiting. What became of Lily, the records do not clearly say. The trial that followed would invoke her over and over as a figure in her mother's defense, but the girl herself stayed out of the papers, and the source that took the closest interest in the family stopped writing about her there. Before the trial began, the newspapers had already written their verdicts. At first, the leading San Francisco papers seemed to blame Laura Fair and Alexander Crittenden roughly equally for the killing. The Examiner was circumspect, stating that it did not care to publish any of the many rumors afloat concerning this most distressing event. The restraint did not last. As the story settled into its telling, Laura became the aggressor and Crittenden the victim. The Examiner soon described him as not the first or second victim of her unbridled passion, painting Laura as a woman who lured men into attachment and then destroyed them. The Chronicle characterized her as a woman of notoriously bad background and violent disposition. From the East Coast, the New York Times weighed in with a sardonic distance. The paper wondered whether men and women were beginning to receive different treatment in the courts, and warned of a dangerous slackness creeping into the application of evidence to female murderers. As for Laura's defense of temporary insanity, the Times noted dryly that her episodes of madness seemed to coincide with moments when it was desirable to put somebody out of the way. By the time the courtroom doors opened, the city had already decided what kind of woman Laura Fair was. The 12 men who would sit in the jury box had been reading these papers for months. At the trial, there was never any question that Laura Fair had fired the shot. The question the courtroom argued, for the better part of a month, was who she was. The prosecution offered one woman. In their telling, she was a practiced seductress who had pursued a respectable man, schemed to take him from his family, and killed him when she failed. To prove it, they did something particular. They read his love letters aloud. The same letters Laura had kept for years, in his own handwriting, were now entered into evidence and turned against her. His devotion became proof of her design. Co-prosecutor Alexander Campbell, who had been Crittenden's own law partner, used the letters to argue that Laura was constantly scheming to pull Alexander from his wife. Campbell connected Laura to the suffragists in the gallery and branded all of them free lovers whose actions endangered the home. The lead prosecutor, Henry Byrne, serving his fourth term, took 2 days over his closing argument. He quoted Scripture and Shakespeare. "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned," he told the jury, and warned that any verdict but guilty would be an insult to the intelligence of the age. He noted that Laura's sex had already bought her special treatment in the courtroom, including a rocking chair, a lounge, and foot baths. A string of men were called to speak of Laura's reputation. None of them could point to a specific act. The defense offered another woman entirely. In their telling, Laura was not wicked but unwell, driven from her reason by Crittenden's betrayals and by a malady the era assigned to her sex. A doctor, John Trask, testified that he had found her suffering from a hysteria brought on by an irregular menstrual cycle, though he admitted under cross-examination that he had initially believed she was feigning her symptoms. Byrne pressed him, could the condition have resulted from excessive indulgence in sexual passion? Trask did not disagree. The nurse who had attended Laura after the arrest, Jane Morris, described the collapse, the hysteria, the bitten glass. Laura's lawyers spoke of partial moral insanity, of delayed menstruation, said to drive the blood to the brain. They offered statistics from a nearby asylum, asserting that most women committed there had been driven mad by disorders of their reproductive systems. Her lead attorney, Elisha Cook, argued that Laura must have been insane to shoot Crittenden in public, when she had had plenty of private opportunities to harm him had she wanted to. On the stand, Laura said she remembered nothing of the boat. The last thing she recalled, she testified, was the disagreeable sound of Clara Crittenden's voice. Both accounts were complete, and they could not both be true. The courtroom was full every day. Women of the new suffrage movement filled the gallery, having taken up Laura's cause. Emily Pitts Stevens, who owned and edited a weekly called The Pioneer, used her paper to lobby on Laura's behalf and to link the case to the furtherance of women's rights. 12 men sat in the jury box, for in the California of 1871, a woman could neither practice law nor serve on a jury. Admission to the bar for women was still 7 years off. The vote was nearly 50. The jury was not long deciding. After about 45 minutes, the 12 men returned a verdict of murder in the first degree, and Laura Fair was sentenced to hang. A little over a year after she was sentenced to hang, Laura Fair walked free. The sentence had made her the first woman in California condemned to death, and it was never carried out. Her conviction went up to the state Supreme Court, where only 2 of the 5 justices took part. One of them, Joseph Crockett, was by then blind and had the case materials read aloud to him by his family. The court reversed the conviction on 2 grounds. The first was procedural. The closing arguments had been delivered in an improper sequence, violating Laura's statutory right to have her attorneys speak last. The second was substantive. Justice William Wallace wrote clearly that Laura had been on trial for murder, not for a violation of Victorian womanhood, and that the evidence admitted to impugn her chastity had been improper. A reputation for chastity, Wallace wrote, was irrelevant to a charge of murder. She was tried a second time. So many people had already formed an opinion that more than 400 prospective jurors had to be summoned before 12 could be seated. Her attorneys tried and failed to win a change of venue. The court reporter noted that those eventually seated were, in his judgment, exceptionally unintelligent. The proceeding was widely called a farce. In sharp contrast to the first trial, which had run for a month, the second lasted 10 days, 8 of them devoted to jury selection. On September 30, 1872, the jury accepted that Laura had been insane when she fired, and she was acquitted. Neither of the men who had built the first case lived to see the second. Elisha Cook, Laura's lead defense attorney, died suddenly on December 31, 1871, leaving a widow and 9 children. Henry Byrne, the prosecutor, suffering from a degenerative brain disease, died on March 22. Their seconds, Leander Quint for the defense and Alexander Campbell for the prosecution, carried on alone. Through it all, women of the suffrage movement had stood with Laura. Emily Pitt Stevens predicted in print that no woman could get a fair trial in a legal system run entirely by men. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, passing through San Francisco on a national campaign in July 1871, came to the jail to visit Laura. Both commented on her case in public speeches. It was not a clean triumph. When Anthony argued from a stage that men had a duty to protect women, and that tragedies like this one proved it, the audience turned on her so sharply that the noted suffragist left the room shaken. The law had not decided that Laura Fair was innocent. It had decided only that it would not hang her. The acquittal did not end Laura Fair's public life so much as fix it in place. The press that had pressed for her conviction was furious. The newspapers complained that the court had given a license to kill to spurned adulterers, and that the verdict was a shameful miscarriage of justice. The country, for its part, kept the version it preferred. In 1874, Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner published a novel, The Gilded Age, in which a character drawn partly from Laura appeared as Laura Hawkins for the amusement of readers who would never meet the real woman. When Laura tried to give her own account, she was refused. She arranged to speak in San Francisco and tell her side of the story under the title A Wolf in the Fold, and the city was so offended by the idea that no hall in it would have her. She gave the lecture elsewhere to a small audience. She had it printed afterward as a pamphlet, hoping that a lecture tour might let her earn a living from her own story. The living never came. The trials had left debts, and the debts left litigation. Cook's widow sued Laura for $10,000, the value of the services her dead husband had rendered. Laura, in turn, sued her own mother for $16,000, allegedly held in trust. Even the prosecutor's estate was contested. It emerged that Byrne had walked away from a marriage to an actress nearly 20 years earlier without ever obtaining a divorce, and the abandoned wife now resurfaced, claiming her share. For years afterward, Laura supported herself as a book agent in the city that had tried her. Clara Crittenden died in 1881. Laura lived on in the Bay Area for decades, out of the headlines that had once argued over her by the column. She died in San Francisco on October 19, 1919. She was 82. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery south of the city. His words had gone into the record. Hers had not. The city that had sentenced her and then freed her never settled what it thought of her, and neither did anyone else. The woman the whole coast had once fought over was simply allowed to disappear.